In this lesson, we're going to be looking at discordant drainage patterns. Now, what do we mean by a discordant drainage pattern? A discordant drainage pattern means that the underlying topography did not influence the pattern of the river. And there are two types of discordant drainage patterns: antecedent drainage and superimposed drainage. Now, let's unpack each of these. Let's start off with antecedent drainage. The word antecedent means it existed before. So in other words, what this means is that the river was there, it established its pattern, and then there was structural change within the topography, and the river then matched that, cut its way through that structural change. So in other words, the river was there, then the landscape was uplifted or folding occurred, and instead of the river trying to match its pattern with the underlying changing geology, it then cut through that particular geology. Now let's look at an example here. Here we see a landscape, it's horizontal, and then it's going to be subjected to compression. And notice how the river doesn't change its pattern at all. It simply just cuts through the fold that was created as a result of the compression. So can we see then that the river existed before, then the landscape changed. So can you see then with antecedent drainage what happens? The stream will maintain its course in spite of crustal compression, and the stream will continue to erode the land at the same rate that compression occurs. And so remember, compression is a slow process, as you see here illustrated, and then what happens is this: as it is compressed, the river now cuts through that landscape, and then it preserves its pattern. And so in this way then, as the landscape changes, the river matches that, and then the landscape doesn't influence the flow of the river. The river maintains its particular flow. Let's now look at another example, and we look at the second example, and that is of superimposed drainage. So what do we mean by superimposed? Superimposed means that it's placed over. So in other words, the drainage was placed over the landscape. And so when we look at the landscape now, the pattern of the river doesn't match the geology of the surface rocks. So what happened is the river cut through the underlying layers, and as it cut through those layers, its pattern did not change. Now let's look at an illustration of this. Here we see a landscape that has got horizontal layers and folded layers. But as the river flows, what now happens? It cuts through, it removes those overlying layers, now encounters the folds, and it doesn't change its pattern. And so you see then this is what happens. Now let's look here at the Magaliesburg area. And here we see an example again of superimposed and patterns that occurred because of the landscape. When you look at the pattern at the top, we're seeing a trellis pattern. Now we'd expect that trellis pattern there because that is the topography of the Magaliesburg area consists of long ridges with gentle dip slopes and steep scarp slopes. So it's a tilted landscape. But now notice the area in the south. It's flowing over the same landscape, but it's got a different pattern. It's got a dendritic pattern. And can you see that's the Crocodile River, which was a much more established river. It was there flowing over the landscape. Then as it flowed over that landscape, it eroded the overlying layers and then placed its pattern over on the underlying rock strata. Now let's draw a closer look. Let's have a closer look at this feature. And so can you see that what we should be seeing is the rivers flowing down the steep dip slope. But we don't see that in this pattern here, because what happens is this, that when we look closer here, we see that the river then just simply placed itself over that landscape. And so we don't have a trellis pattern, we actually have a dendritic pattern. So can we see what happened? The river cut down, it exhumed the underlying tilted rock layers, and then the river now flows over that tilted strata or folded strata and has maintained its dendritic pattern. Let us look at another example, and this is the example of the Grand Canyon. So here what happened is this, that rejuvenation occurred and the river then had greater energy and cut through. So there's the horizontal layer, was uplift occurred, and the river now cut through and created incised meanders, created incised valleys because it cut through that. Now let's look at those incised valleys closer. Can you see now how steep they've cut down into the river? The river's maintained its particular direction, but now what it's done is it's cut steeply into the valley itself. And so when you look at this picture here, you see how it has created very steep-sided valleys. And so it looks like a river in its upper course, but what has happened is the river now, because of rejuvenation, has been able to cut deeply into the landscape, and so therefore it placed its pattern over the landscape. So can you see then the differences between superimposed drainage and antecedent drainage? Antecedent drainage, the river changes, adjusts itself to the change in the landscape. So as the landscape changes, the river then cuts through that changing landscape. Whereas with superimposed drainage, the underlying layers were always there. They're old layers, they're deeper layers. But as the river then cuts through the overlying layers, it exposes the underlying layers. But when it cuts through those underlying layers do not influence the pattern. It simply places itself over the underlying layers.